will listen to an array of experts about the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. I am proud that Kiribati, Kazakhstan, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, Reverse the Trend, and the Marshallese Educational Initiative are sponsoring this event. I would like to also acknowledge some of our many activists in the room, as well as Benetick Kabua-Maddison, the Executive Director of the Marshallese Educational Initiative, and Marcelo there, Program Coordinator. We greatly appreciate our partnership with NDI. We will first listen to representatives from Kiribati and Kazakhstan, two effective state parties which have been spearheading efforts on raising awareness about victim assistance, environmental mediation, international cooperation assistance at all multilateral arenas. Then we will hear from the Marshallese Educational Initiative, I would like to also mention that copies of Kiribati and Kazakhstan's working paper addressing the past use of nuclear weapons from the back of the room. So on that note, I would like to welcome Ambassador Teburoro Tito, the permanent representative of Kiribati. And he was also the former president of the country, to provide some brief remarks about the current situation in Kiribati and explain why the country is spearheading efforts on victim assistance and environmental protection.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you for the introduction. And the first time I'm labeled as an expert, which I don't mind. I don't mind being called an expert. But I know quite a bit about the subject that we're going to discuss. So, welcome to all of you. Thank you for giving me the honor of sharing my views and thoughts and my story about the subject that we are here to talk about, the nuclear legacy, the harm done to human beings and to the environment as a result of the nuclear tests in the Pacific Ocean, including my island Kiribati. So this is what I will now. This is my story. More than 300 nuclear tests were conducted in the Pacific Ocean between 1947 and 1962. The UK and the United States tested 33 nuclear devices at Malden and Christmas Island in my country, Kiribati. Furthermore, between 1946 to 1958, the US conducted 67 nuclear tests in the Marshall Islands. These nuclear tests created both long-lasting environmental harm and humanitarian suffering amongst the citizens of the Pacific region. The humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons is well known. At the 2010 NPT Review Conference, state parties recognized the humanitarian consequences. In its conclusions and recommendations for follow-on actions, the conference expressed its deep concern at the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons and reaffirmed the need for all states and all times to comply with applicable international law, including international humanitarian law. At the 2022 NPT Review Conference, Kazakhstan and Kiribati highlighted the need for the states parties to engage with affected communities and address contaminated environment. Building upon our recognition that so we need to keep pushing for the inclusion of victim assistance and financial compensation. This is imperative as many of our people are suffering from the nuclear test. The great powers tested, but they need the nuclear test with the great powers tested. And we need assistance as a result of that. As contained in our working paper with Kazakhstan, we did make a number of recommendations. I believe Zhangeldy will go into detail on this. But let me say that I'm ready to answer any question about what happened in my country. And Kibes is committed to play its part, especially when it was an affected country. It was affected by the test. And we feel for those who are also affected. Not only where the bomb, where the test was done, but even where the material was being mined. And we've heard the stories about our friends in the United States and others, where the mine was done and people are affected, communities affected. We're very human in the Pacific. We're very human. I mean, we're all human, but we're more human than we're very close to nature. Nature is with us every day. We mingle with nature. And when people suffer out there, we see them suffer, we suffer too. That's how we feel. We get very easily affected because of our human nature in the Pacific way. And I remember the UN Charter, Article 6, talks about Pacific settlement of disputes. Now, I've been asking people, why did they put the word Pacific settlement instead of peaceful settlement of dispute? There must be a reason, and I think the reason is that's the reason why I'm from the Pacific. I think we have a role to play to tell the world, be like the Pacific people one day. You don't have to fight when you're in the Pacific. We don't believe in fighting. We believe in peace, believe in reconciliation, believe in talking. When we see signs of trouble, we come straight, pour water and then make it cool and nice and get everybody dancing and happy again. That's the world we want to see. I know it's not like that now. It's not been like that for many hundreds of years, but the Pacific is already there. And if you want to know more about, come to the Pacific. Be with us, be on Christmas Island, and you will learn more about it. So thank you again. I hope we have an interesting interaction.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Tito. So next we will hear from Zhangeldy Srymbet, Counsellor in the Prohibition of Kazakhstan to the United Nations in New York. He will discuss Kazakhstan's engagement on nuclear justice. Zhangeldy is the focal point at the Mission of Kazakhstan for victim assistance, environmental remediation, international cooperation and assistance. We work closely together on promoting justice for affected states. So please.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you, Ambassador Tito, for your statements. Dear ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, colleagues, thank you very much for joining us today, for spending your precious time for this side event on the issues of the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. As we meet today, let us recall that since the time of the first nuclear weapon was detonated in 75 years ago in 1945, at least 8 nations have carried out a total of 2,056 nuclear tests, around 1/4 of them in the atmosphere, causing long-term harm to human health and survival, and the environment and the planet. As the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, ICANN, has stated, more than 60 sites around the world bear the scars of these tests. Even just the 528 atmospheric tests had a destructive power equal to 29,000 bombs than the one just delivered in Hiroshima, dispersing radiative particles far and wide, poisoning the environment for all times. And my country is another example of such a negative impact of radiation, environmental contamination. After the 256 nuclear tests carried out at the Semipalatinsk nuclear test site, and around 1.5 million people were affected by this testing. People could ask what is the connection of these issues with the NPT, where we are gathering this week. We can recall the 2010 action plan of the NPT review conference, where the humanitarian impact has been stressed, and states parties expressed their concern over this issue. And after that, there have been 4 conferences on nuclear weapons, on humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. And finally, in 2017, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons was adopted, and now it's in force. And people also could ask why Kazakhstan and Kiribati, 2 different countries from different regions, are working together on this issue, because we share a similar history, a similar tragedy of nuclear testing, and people in our countries are still suffering. We have in this room a representative of the Semipalatinsk nuclear test site in the 3rd generation. You know, our colleagues from Japan, they call all of them hibakusha, because they suffered from these deadly weapons. And our idea is to continue, of course, raising awareness of the negative impact of these weapons in order to prevent nuclear catastrophe in the future by promoting the TPNW, and also to help those who suffered from this testing in the past. And one of the practical ideas is to establish the International Trust Fund, and our 2 states parties are working on the modalities of this possible enterprise, which we hope will bring tangible support to those who are impacted, especially victims of nuclear testing. And of course, my country, we have had some experience on the decontamination of the polluted areas, so we may share with other countries in case there is such a request. And one of the ideas of this trust fund is to support those who are in need. And we have distributed our working paper for this PrepCom on these issues of victim assistance and environmental remediation. Last year at the review conference, we also made a joint statement, and we'll continue this endeavor together. We join you. We invite you to join us and support not only the papers or the statements, but support us in making a voice for reaching our noble goal of nuclear weapon-free world as soon as possible. I'm happy to be engaged in the discussion, but will let my distinguished panel colleagues to deliver their statements. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zhangeldy. So now we will hear from Benetick Kabua-Maddison, the Executive Director of the Marshallese Educational Initiative, who will share his perspectives on nuclear justice. MEI, the Marshallese Educational Initiative, is a non-profit-based organization in Springdale, Arkansas, where the highest concentration of Marshallese reside in the continental United States. Born in Nashua Atoll, Maddison migrated to the Ozark Mountains of Arkansas with his family at the age of 6. His work in MEI includes leading efforts to raise awareness of the biological, ecological, and cultural consequences of the nuclear testing legacy on his homeland, as well as the impact of climate change. Benetick has spoken at conferences and events in the U.S. and internationally, including addressing the United Nations General Assembly in September 2022. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christian. Good afternoon. I wish to thank the organizers for today's panel, the Republics of Kazakhstan, Kiribati, and the Marshall Islands, the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, the Reverse the Trend, and the Marshallese Educational Initiative, and for the opportunity to speak today. On the morning of March 1st, 1954, at 6:45 a.m., the Marshall Islands witnessed the explosion of the most powerful hydrogen bomb ever tested by the United States. The nuclear device, codenamed Castle Bravo, was 1,000 times the force of the little boy the atomic bomb dropped on innocent lives in Hiroshima. Those who witnessed Castle Bravo, my elders and ancestors, were scared and confused. My people thought another world war had broken out, given that the Marshall Islands were a World War II battleground a decade before the Castle Bravo detonation. They also thought it was Armageddon, the last battle between good and evil mentioned in the book of Revelation. So people ran into hiding, asking God for forgiveness, thinking it was their final moments together. There are many stories from many of the older generations of Marshallese, including our late climate ambassador, Tony DeBroom, who was a young boy at the time of the Castle Bravo detonation. Mr. DeBroom said, and I quote, "When I was 9 years old, I remember well the 1954 Bravo shot at Bikini Atoll, the largest detonation the world had ever seen. It was the morning, and I was fishing with my grandfather. He was throwing the net, and suddenly, the silent, bright flash, and then a force, the shockwave. Everything turned red. The ocean, the fish, the sky, and my grandfather's net. And we were 200 miles away from ground zero, a memory that can never be erased, and one of many from the Marshallese, which must inform and underpin global political will on nuclear disarmament." End of quote. My grandparents also witnessed the explosion, including my paternal grandmother, who was only a young girl when she and her people were forcibly removed from their homelands on Bikini Atoll by the US Navy for nuclear weapons testing. I asked my grandmother what she saw that day, and she said everything was red. It was unlike anything they had ever seen. The testing, unfortunately, happened at her home atoll, Bikini, a home she left 8 years prior and never will be able to return to. Less than 100 miles away was the atoll of Rora. The people on that atoll would be among the first to experience the nuclear fallout. In the Marshall Islands, it does not snow, as the weather is warm all year round. However, the people on Rora Atoll that day, including other communities within the impacted area, thought the nuclear ash was snow. The people, especially the children, ate it, and they rubbed it on their hair and body. Soon, the people had skin burns, hairs fell out, and they experienced other changes in their bodies. Several days after Castle Bravo, on March 7th, the United States sent officials to assess the situation on Rora. Unbeknownst to the people and the leaders of the Marshall Islands, Project 4.1 was underway. It was a secret medical study conducted by doctors from the Atomic Energy Commission, today's US Department of Energy. The purpose of Project 4.1 was not to treat Marshallese exposed to nuclear fallout, but to understand the effects of nuclear radiation on human beings. My people were test subjects, and our homelands became a science laboratory. The American scientists said of my people, and I quote, "They are more like us than mice." End of quote. Between 1946 and 1958, the United States conducted 67 large-scale atomic and hydrogen bombs in the Marshall Islands, equivalent to 7,200 Hiroshima bombs. These weapons of mass destructions are not historical incidents, but created a pattern of human rights violations that continues today. Some parts of the Marshall Islands are rendered uninhabitable. People cannot eat traditional food, and some communities cannot live in their rightful homelands in their own country. In the 1960s, women began experiencing thyroid problems, and they gave birth to jellyfish babies. No legs, arms, eyes, mouth, or head. Miscarriages, unfortunately, are common in my community. We also suffer from all types of cancer, including leukemia, colon, ovarian, stomach, and liver cancers. Furthermore, the destruction and contamination of our lands mean that people depend on imported food from the outside world, processed food that contributes to high rates of diabetes and heart diseases. Though we are experiencing these health issues that we know will impact future generations of Marshallese, we have yet to achieve nuclear justice and adequate compensation to address these nuclear-related illnesses that are killing my community. What the United States provided under the 177 Agreement of the Compact of Free Association with the Marshall Islands is unfair and unjust. All the money in the world will never be enough to undo the biological, ecological, and cultural consequences of the U.S. nuclear testing program on the Marshall Islands. It is why my people and I will continue to play an important role internationally to ensure nuclear weapons and risk are no more, as the pain and suffering inflicted on us continues, and we hope that other communities and countries will not have to experience what we are dealing with every single day. Nuclear weapons do not generate world peace and security. Decades after the NPT was signed, decades after the world experienced heightened threats of the Cold War, and decades after the conclusion of the U.S. nuclear testing program on the Marshall Islands, the risk of nuclear weapons use is higher than ever since the Cold War. The nuclear issue is not only an issue of treaty, commitments, or international law. It is not only an issue of ethics or morals, but it is also an issue of common sense. Our common goal is to eliminate nuclear weapons. Our common goals to eliminate nuclear weapons must be achieved in our lifetime. And one of the many ways to accomplish this is through storytelling. The nuclear narrative of my people will be shared far and wide to ensure that more people are aware of our experiences and the dangers of nuclear weapons, and to join our fight for a nuclear-free world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Benetick, for those moving comments. Now we will hear from Dr. Ivana Hughes, President of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. Dr. Hughes is a senior lecturer in the discipline of chemistry at Counsellor and a member of the scientific advisory group of the TPNW.
Thank you, Christian, so much for the introduction and for everything you did to make today's event possible. I also want to acknowledge our many interns in the room who have just been so wonderful and fabulous. And of course, all of the panelists for their wise and insightful remarks, and all of you for being with us today. So I want, let's see. Yes, it's working. So the topic of our discussion today is humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, and our knowledge and understanding of the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons has grown exponentially since the advent of the nuclear age, and it would truly be impossible in one event to tell you everything there is to know about this. And it's even a harder task to do that in just one of the presentations of the panel, but I'm just going to try to give you three really snippets of what we have learned about what nuclear weapons have done in the past, what they continue to do at present, and what they have the potential to do in the future. And so what I'm going to focus on is what have we learned about what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's our past lesson. We heard from Benetick about what has happened to people in the Marshall Islands, and what I'm going to stress and I'm going to show some actual data from recent years that I have been involved in, the research and work I have been involved in, to show you precisely what Benetick said. He said his grandmother cannot go back to her homeland of Bikini Atoll. And I'm going to show you data that says why that's just not possible. And lastly, as I said, I'll talk a little bit about the humanitarian consequences of a future in which nuclear weapons continue to exist. And even if you have something that has a very low probability of happening, if you keep playing the game, it's going to happen. So the only thing is, are we going to abolish nuclear weapons before they abolish us? So we'll get to that in just a moment. So Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and I want to focus on long-term impacts on health. Of course, we all know here about what happened. We know about the flattened cities. We know about the approximately 230,000 people who died by the end of 1945, either from being incinerated, murdered immediately as the bombs dropped, or from injuries, or from impacts of radiation. What is far less known is the way in which that exposure to radiation has impacted people, has impacted the survivors, the hibakusha, to this day. And so what I'm showing you here are actually results from a 60-year-long study of survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the data I'm showing here come from Mary Olson, who has looked at the data, the collected data, and made some really important observations about what those data actually tell us about how radiation impacts us differently based on age and based on gender. And so what we're looking at in this graph is on the x-axis, what you see is the age that people were at the time of the exposure, how old you were when these attacks happened. And then what you see on the y-axis is the increased risk of getting cancer later in life, at some point in your life, and this was studied for 60 years. And there are two really astounding conclusions from looking at this graph. The first is that very obviously, your risk of getting cancer later in life is far higher if you were younger rather than older at the when the exposure actually happened. And secondly, there are two curves. It's not one curve. We're not all impacted the same way by radiation. And women at all ages. So if you compare a 30-year-old male and a 30-year-old female, or you compare an infant, at all ages, women are more susceptible to getting cancer. The younger, the larger the difference. At age of an infant, it's twice the rate of cancer later in life. And at age, say 30, it's a 3-to-2 ratio. So really important lesson that we have to think and be very cognizant about what is even considered to be safe exposure to radiation, because it simply does not impact us the same way. So my second lesson, again, reverting back to Benedikt's testimony about what happened in the Marshall Islands, I'm just going to show you some snippets of data about what the radiological conditions are like in the Marshall Islands today. This is work that I have been involved in. But before I show that, let me just show this map, just to remind everybody. We heard about Kazakhstan, we heard about Kiribati, we heard about the Marshall Islands, but of course nuclear testing took place all around the world, on all of the different continents actually, except for Central and South America. So from we have the Soviet Union. So let me back up for 1 second. On this map, the different colors indicate the country that performed the testing. So yellow is Algeria and French Polynesia, so that's the French nuclear testing program. Red is the Soviet Union nuclear testing program, and here's Kazakhstan. Purple is China. And then we have this kind of pink, which is the UK, some testing in Australia, and then a lot in Kiribati, and we heard about Kiribati already. The US also tested in Kiribati, as well as, of course, in the Marshall Islands, and on its own territory in the American Southwest. So I'm gonna, when it comes to the Marshall Islands, so, I think it's fair to say that the lion's share of nuclear testing took place in the Pacific. Marshall Islands were where the US essentially wrote the playbook for the nuclear testing era. As you heard from Benetick, it was 67 tests, but that number simply doesn't do it justice because it was the equivalent of 7,000, as he said, and 200 nuclear bombs. So in the Marshall Islands, there were actually 2 testing sites. One is called Eniwetok Atoll, and the other is the Bikini Atoll. Bikini is a whole story in and of itself, and I think it's such a long-term trivialization of this issue through our popular culture, where we all think of bikini and we think of the swimsuit, and it's maddening. Really, but I want you to think about Bikini Atoll and Bikini Island, where people were living prior to the testing. They moved out in mid-February, and by the end of June, the U.S. began its tests, and most of the tests done in the Marshall Islands were actually done in Bikini Atoll. This is a map of Bikini Island from just a couple of years ago. This is work that I have been involved in with colleagues and students at Columbia University. We are looking at one kind of measurement. We've done multiple studies, many different kinds of measurements, so I'm just showing you really just a couple of things. And this is a measurement of something called external background gamma radiation. That is, gamma radiation is just like the light that we see. It's just like X-rays, it's just like UV that you put sunscreen on to protect yourself from. It just has what are called much shorter wavelengths, and it's much more energetic. So it can really harm your DNA, it can harm your cells, and so on. We get exposed to gamma radiation from natural sources. What we're seeing here in the Marshall Islands is not natural at all. In other faraway islands, at sea level, gamma radiation is very, very low. And so what you're seeing here is a map where the black dots indicate places where we made measurements, and the colors actually correspond to what sort of simulated values based on those measurements and what those values are. And I'll just tell you that so the color scheme is shown here on the right, and you see everything from kind of purple to the dark red, so it sort of goes, higher and higher and higher. And I'll just tell you that in the United States, there is a limit by the Environmental Protection Agency of 15 milligrams per year. That's the maximum that people can be exposed to if they live, for example, near a nuclear power plant. 15 would be purple in this map, and we clearly see that Bikini is not purple. If anything, we see a lot of red. These are values that are about 30 times higher than that limit that I mentioned by the EPA. So I'm going to show you another kind of measurement, and again, these are just some of the measurements we can make to determine what the radiological conditions are like. And this measurement pertains precisely to what Benetick was referring to, which is the food safe? And it's one thing when we talk about this external gamma radiation and you can walk around and so on. It's another thing to take in food that actually then produces radiation inside your body. This kind of internal exposure is extremely, extremely dangerous to health. Cesium-137, this is a little chemistry lesson, is chemically similar to potassium. And you all know that when you eat a banana, you take in potassium. And so not only the cesium-137 is it capable of incorporating itself into the food sources, like bananas, it turns out in the Marshall Islands, it's coconuts and breadfruit and pandanus and so on. But it's also true that when we eat it, it incorporates itself. Some of our cells use potassium, and so it incorporates, like your brain actually needs potassium to function properly, and lots of soft tissues. It incorporates itself, and there, because it releases gamma rays, now it's bombarding your cells from the inside. And so I'm also going to show you just a map of the Bikini Atoll. We've actually made measurements on over 20 different islands in 4 different atolls in the Marshall Islands, but I'm showing you stuff from Benedick's grandmother's homeland. And here, so here I have a different, it's again a kind of a color map. And these are values that we actually sort of made this green to red color-coded, transfer of values based on some of the limits that exist out there for what is a safe, considered to be safe amount of the cesium-137 in the food. I'm just gonna point out that the green values here would actually comply with infant food requirements from Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine, 3 of the countries that dealt with the Chernobyl disaster and put forth these limits based on that. The blue color is actually values that would violate those Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine limits, but would not violate, there's a Japanese limit that is not for infant food, it's for all other food, that's 100, and these units of becquerels per kilogram are not important, but let's just call it 100. And then down here, the yellow would be violating the Japanese limit, but not violating the European Union's limit, which is 600 becquerels per kilogram for regular food. And then orange would be violating the European Union's limit, but not violating the US FDA. The US FDA has by far the highest limit of what is permissible for cesium-137 in the food. And finally, red values would violate that US FDA limit. And so what I hope you can see, it's probably difficult, but what I hope you can see is we measured about 40 fruits on Bikini Island. There were no green fruits. There were a couple of blue fruits. Most of the fruits were yellow. Some were orange, and several were even red. To this day, this food is not safe to eat. And this is almost 70 years since 65 years since the testing ended in the Marshall Islands. So let me just end on the scariest, most depressing, I think, scientific data ever brought forth. And it is, has to do with what the humanitarian consequences of nuclear war would actually be. And this is sort of an interesting story because scientists discovered this first in the early 1980s after they figured out what happened to the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. So we figured out that 65 million years ago, an asteroid hit the Earth and created conditions that simply led to this mass extinction. It turns out that there were little mammals that could bury in the ground and survive on very little food, and they sort of mated and evolved into us today. But when scientists discovered this kind of mass extinction event, they tried to think whether there were conditions, there was something that could happen today to create such conditions and essentially wipe out humanity. And they realized that actually we can create that ourselves. We can cause our own extinction. And they named this nuclear winter, and you can also think of it as nuclear famine. So the idea is relatively simple. The idea is that nuclear war would cause nuclear winter because you would release so much soot into the atmosphere, blocking incoming sunlight, reducing temperatures all around the globe, and essentially preventing food from growing. And once food is not growing and ecosystems begin to collapse, food availability would go down significantly. And people would begin to starve. And this is actually a table from fairly recent, so this has been, there are 40 years worth of scientific work on this, but where we are now is really just state-of-the-art work that's been enabled in many ways by all of the research that's been devoted to climate change. So all of the models that we use for understanding how the increase in temperature will impact us have been used to also understand how the decrease in temperature would impact us. So I know it's hard to see, but I'm gonna just point out a couple of these models. So these are different models based on how many nuclear warheads would be used, what the yield of those nuclear warheads would be, and then calculating the amount of soot, how much soot would be put out into the atmosphere. Let me just point out one thing, which is that nowadays we know that we put soot out when we have widespread wildfires, right? That soot doesn't go so high up into the atmosphere. It actually stays fairly low and then rains down. This kind of soot from nuclear explosions would go so far into the atmosphere, it would not rain down. It would stay there for several years, which is more than plenty for us to starve to death. So, so let me just point out, the middle one is the scenario of India and Pakistan using their nuclear arsenals. 127 million people would die from the direct attacks, and over 2 billion would die from starvation. These numbers, the starvation numbers, are actually based on a worldwide population of 7 billion. We have now passed 8 billion, so you could easily add 1 billion to each of the numbers in the right column, because having more people, there will not be more food. It will just be more people starving. And then I'll point out the last scenario, which is the US and Russia using approximately 1/3 of their arsenals, and we have 360 million deaths. And again, this is 5.4 billion. I would safely say that that's easily over 6 billion people dying of starvation. So what do we have to do? We have to get rid of nuclear weapons before they get rid of us. Nuclear zero is not impossible. the TPNW is a way forward, and it is a way forward that's compatible with the NPT, because the NPT needs to come clean on its promises of nuclear disarmament. The other thing I'll point out, and it's been shared by our panelists already, is that the TPNW has humanitarian provisions for victim assistance and environmental remediation. And that is incredibly important work. So thank you. I know I went a little over time, but thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ivana. So following, we will watch a short video by Dr. Becky Alexis Martin, the Assistant Professor of Peace and International Development at the University of Bradford. Dr. Becky Alexis Martin is unfortunately unable to be here in person as she's traveling right now to Christmas Island in Kiribati. So she kindly provided a video for us to watch.
Hi, I'm Dr. Becky Alexis Martin, and I'm at the University of Bradford Institute for Peace and International Development. So I'm sorry I can't join you today, but it's my pleasure to still be able to talk to you a little bit about my work. So those of you who don't know me might want a bit more information about what I do. So to give you some context, my research focuses on the lives and well-being of communities affected by nuclear weapons testing and nuclear warfare from 1945 to the present day. And I've studied these communities internationally and written about the effects of nuclear warfare and nuclear weapons testing in my book called Disarming Doomsday. My most recent studies have explored the lives and experiences of families who have been affected by nuclear weapons due to having a veteran, a nuclear test veteran family member in the UK. That study was called Nuclear Families and ran from 2015 to 2018. And my other larger study looked at communities affected by nuclear weapons in Kiribati, in the Republic of Kazakhstan. That study is ongoing. It's on to its second phase now. So the first phase of that study addressed the humanitarian and environmental consequences of atmospheric nuclear weapons tests, following fieldwork by myself and by Matt Bray-Bolton in 2017 and 2018. So this paper we put together, we worked with Dimity Hawkins, who's got an amazing project called the Nuclear Peace Project. That's just astonishing. It's brilliant. And Sidley Tish and Tale Lucia Mangione as well. And the purpose of our work was really to try and, explore the impacts of the British and American nuclear weapons tests that arose from 1957 to 1962. Because during this time, the UK and USA tested 33 atmospheric nuclear weapon tests during the Grapple and the Operation Dominic series of nuclear weapon tests. And my work explored kind of how the obligations of the 2017 Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons could kind of offer an important new opportunity to address the consequences of these nuclear detonations in Kiribati by focusing policy attention and constituting a new field of development assistance. So our argument for this paper, our 2021 paper, was that policy interventions to date haven't adequately addressed the needs and rights of survivors in the UK and the USA. Our work explored how victim assistance and environmental remediation concerns and obligations for this treaty, so Article 6 and Article 7 of the TPNW, could offer an important new opportunity for addressing the consequences of nuclear detonations. And looking at the humanitarian and human rights framing of effects on nuclear weapons testing offers an alternative to kind of denialism and the litigation and liability model as well. And we also considered how the community seek not just medical assistance, but support for practices of recognition, acknowledgement and memorialisation to address psychosocial and cultural consequences of the test programmes themselves, and how these policy interventions should acknowledge the intrinsic value that many Pacific people place on the environment and not just its instrumental worth. So this study has, obviously shown that there's a need for greater support for the community. The next phase of my work is looking at atomic epistemic justice in Kiribati after the TPNW, because it came into force in 2021. It's happening now, which is amazing. The community still isn't facilitated to engage with policy implementation mode. And through no fault of their own, representative members aren't always able to be present or aren't always involved in UN TPNW events and debates, which represents what we call epistemic justice, so an injustice of knowledge as defined by Fricker 2007, whereby the community are not being heard. And it's very important that the community of Kiribati are heard. It's very important that we know what the community want and that global policy listens, includes and recognises their lived experience. And we talk a lot about the importance of supporting survivors of nuclear weapons testing, but we don't talk quite so much about the important, and essential engagement and outreach strategies that are needed to ensure that the likelihood of successful support and receipt of appropriate reparations happens. So my current work is kind of looking at what the community needs and wants, and thinking about kind of how we can begin to ensure that the community is fully engaged now that we have ratification of the Treaty for Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So my work takes practical and academic steps towards understanding and addressing atomic epistemic justice in Kiribati, and essentially kind of almost making people like me redundant. That's my hope, is that it will give the community a toolkit to advocate for themselves with autonomy and to say what they want and what they need with a comprehensive understanding of the Treaty for Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So I'm engaging with local stakeholders and the community to discern TPNW knowledge baselines. I'm providing participatory community workshops in plain language to co-produce TPNW knowledge, and I'm discussing and identifying preferred TPNW engagement routes with local stakeholders and communities to put together a community-led nuclear involvement community engagement strategy, with the aim obviously that the community decides what they want and how they want to do it and starts to think forward, and gives them that space and that information so that they can do this. I'll also be producing an extensive community database, both for the community of organisations that may be helpful to them, and also for organisations of community members who want to participate and who want to be involved but haven't been included before. I'll identify opportunities to improve connectivity and communication through technology. So we know obviously that the Republic of Kiribati doesn't have always the technology that it deserves and needs to be a global player and to operate on a global, global infrastructure. So one of the things I'll be doing is looking at and surveying the community to think about kind of how we could improve this and improve their options for access. The purpose of my study really is to kind of make myself redundant from a practical perspective, and to help the community move forward and decide with dignity what they want and what they need in light of the Article 6 and Article 7 of the Treaty for Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, thinking forward to things like the possibility of a future trust fund for humanitarian and environmental justice to be produced. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you. If you want to get in touch with me about my research, you can email me at the University of Bradford. My email is b.alexis-martin@bradford.ac.uk. Otherwise, I wish you all the best with the NPT. It's a really important event, I'll be cheering you all on from the Pacific. Thank you so much for your time. Goodbye.
Dr. Alexis Martin, and all the panelists. And now I'd like to open up the floor for any questions that our esteemed audience members may have. Yes, I see.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to thank Kazakhstan, Kiribati, and the Marshall Islands, and the NPT Foundation for organizing and sponsoring this event. I wanted to make 4 points. The first is a question to Mr. Zhangeldy Srymbet of Kazakhstan, and this relates to the joint working paper submitted by Kazakhstan and Kiribati, which is working paper 27, in particular to paragraph 21 and 23. So in paragraph 21, it is said that the recognition of the responsibilities of the nuclear weapon states, as well as those states that rely on defense arrangements based on nuclear weapons for the humanitarian and environmental consequences. But in paragraph 23, where financial compensation is requested, only the nuclear weapon states are identified. So my question is, why are not those countries that are in defense arrangements that are underpinned by nuclear weapons not also held responsible for providing compensation? Because of course these countries benefit from the results of nuclear weapons testing in the affected communities, even though they may not have tested these devices themselves. Now, until June this year, we had roughly 12,500 nuclear weapons, of course possessed by 9 nuclear weapon states, but they were present in 14 countries, and as of June we have 14 plus 1 country. And there were 107 locations where these weapons were deployed, and after June it's 107 plus 1 or maybe 2. So the role of nuclear weapons is increasing and not decreasing, which is in stark contrast to what the nuclear weapon states and their allies have accepted in various NPT review conferences. So in this regard, I appreciated the statement made by the Nuclear Peace Age Foundation on the compatibility of the TPNW with the NPT. And I was completely astounded by the intervention by the Netherlands yesterday and the previous day by Lithuania on the compatibility of NATO nuclear sharing with the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Nothing could be further from the truth. So I will quote to you the statement by the Netherlands, which was, I think, in the right of a reply. It says, NATO nuclear arrangements have always been and continue to be fully consistent with the NPT. False. It's a completely false narrative. And second, these nuclear arrangements have seamlessly integrated, or the seamless integration of NATO's nuclear sharing arrangements into the NPT, which has long been accepted and publicly understood by all states parties to the NPT. Again, a falsehood. So I hope other non-nuclear weapon states will challenge such falsehoods. So instead of arguing for the compatibility of the TPNW with the NPT, here a claim is being made that having nuclear weapons in non-nuclear weapon states, which in time of war will be delivered by the air forces of non-nuclear weapon states hosting these nuclear weapons, they might be under joint command for the release of nuclear weapons, but nonetheless, we have non-nuclear weapon state pilots piloting warplanes of non-nuclear weapon states, carrying nuclear weapons, so therefore they are under the control of non-nuclear weapon states, again, incompatible with the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Now, in the presentation by the Nuclear Peace Age Foundation, where it was showed the locations where nuclear weapon tests took place, I would suggest to also consider the event which took place on the 22nd of September 1979 at 12:53 GMT, where a US electronic reconnaissance satellite called the Vela picked up a double flash of an atmospheric test south of South Africa. Months later, the thyroids of sheep in Western Australia were discovered to be contaminated with iodine 131. And so if the sheep's thyroids were contaminated, obviously the people living in Perth and in that belt of Western Australia bordering the Indian Ocean very likely also received this dose of iodine. So this is yet another affected community, and perhaps the other affected communities might consider reaching out to them. And a point that I made yesterday in another event was that when seeking compensation from the nuclear weapon states, and I would also suggest the states benefiting from nuclear weapons, to consider a class action suit of some sort to go to the International Court of Justice filed by the three countries sponsoring this particular discussion for compensation for the trust fund that we are seeking to establish. And my final comment is relating to the Hiroshima and Nagasaki use of nuclear weapons. So nuclear weapons have been used twice, although in our discourse we seem to pretend that nuclear weapons were only used once, but they've been used twice. And if there is to unfortunately be yet another use of nuclear weapons, that would be the third time. So I was on a panel established by the then Foreign Minister of Japan, Mr. Kishida, who is now the current Foreign Minister, and on that panel was Dr. Masahiko Tomonaga. He's the head of the Japanese Red Cross and also the director of the Nagasaki Atomic Bomb Hospital. And he claimed that the medical data of the survivors of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings was not shared with the Japanese medical authorities for at least 15 years after the bombs were dropped on these two cities. So it means that these poor survivors, the hibakusha, were treated as medical experiments. Otherwise, why would not the data be shared with the Japanese government so that medical care and remediation could be provided to the surviving hibakusha? So with that, I will end. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Rauf, for your excellent and comprehensive questions and comments. Given the presentations by our esteemed experts, we can understand and see that all weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear weapons, are immoral because their purpose, and probably the only purpose, is not to protect but to destroy. And there are two dimensions of this endeavors. First is moral, and the other one is legal. Everyone in the world understands that these weapons are immoral. However, just states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons confirm that they are illegal. In terms of our paper, we outlined that it should be provided adequate justice to the victims of nuclear weapons related activities. And speaking realistically, we would rather go with the voluntary approach. There are also some rumors that if nuclear weapons possessing states provide compensation, this might be a sort of justification of their immoral activities. And some states parties to the treaty of the TPNW would not agree with such approach, that they should first accede to the treaty and then provide all the rest of the implementation action plans to the Article 6 and 7. That is why we would rather go with this voluntary activity as the trust fund, and so we hope that the success of the implementation of the TPNW will be a good reason for others to join, and then of course to reach, maybe not in the near future, we hope that in the midterm, the world free of nuclear weapons. But it depends, of course, on the political will and wisdom of, first of all, nuclear weapon states. And we encourage them to sit down and increase confidence-building measures, negotiations, which can come to reduction and to the total elimination of nuclear weapons. Maybe my esteemed colleague would like to add to this question. If not, I hope I answered your question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Anyone else like to respond?
Thank you for mentioning the South Africa test and the information about IDAN 131. I mean, that's so much of what we see in terms of that immediate impact is about IDAN 131, which doesn't persist in the environment as long. Actually has a half-life of 8 days, and so within several weeks it's completely gone. Things like cesium-137, which I spoke about, that isotope has a half-life of about 30 years, so that means it's around for hundreds of years, a couple of hundred years at least. Another isotope I didn't mention is strontium-90, which behaves like calcium, and we have some evidence that that's present in the Marshall Islands as well. And so that's really an important observation. I agree with you that the ICJ would be an ideal venue to bring these issues forward. The problem, of course, is that so many of the states that we're talking about would not be party to any sort of litigation because they just refuse to be a party, and that's where obviously the advisory opinion is and could be helpful, but it's also non-binding. It's not something they have to act on. But thinking about ways to bring these issues into the international sphere, within the treaty and perhaps beyond the treaty, I agree with you, is absolutely critical. And to me, this kind of work is truly about righting the historical wrongs, but it is also about the lessons for the present and the future of what we do not want to repeat and what we do not want to happen again. So thank you